welcome to Suncoast In Depth. I'm Pastor Brett Watson, and this is, I believe, the 6th installment in our religion, the human quest for reconnection. And we're continuing our talk on Islam, specifically looking at the time after the death of Muhammad, and particularly focused on the political history of Islam from that time forward to the present. So what is the political history? Well, in 632, you had the death of Muhammad, and Abu Bakr becomes the first elected caliph. Well, this is for the Sunni Muslims. You have the Sharia Muslims who, oppose that, but we talked about that in the last video. But the first elected caliph and therefore the successor among Sunnis to the prophet. And the reality is that this ushered in a kind of golden age, although I think 3 out of 4 of the caliphs of what's known as the 4 rightly guided caliphs were assassinated. So, nevertheless, it did bring a lot of political stability to the Middle Eastern region and a lot of peaceful coexistence. This surprises many Westerners, but peaceful coexistence between very diverse Islamic people and among Jews and Christians as well. So that's the early part of the history. Now, this golden age that I spoke of is seen by Islamist groups like ISIS as a goal to bring back that golden age, according to their interpretation of it. And this is not, and I want to be clear about this, this is not an aspiration necessarily held by the majority of Muslims. But Islamists are a significant minority movement, and we should not pretend that this isn't true. And that movement embraces ideas or an ideology that Islam can be the basis of government, which, of course, does clash with Western democratic values significantly. And we can't pretend that acknowledging that reality makes us Islamophobic. That's just not true. Anyway, so we see this rise of not only the 4 rightly guided caliphs and the kind of Islamic empire, but you also see the rise of what's known as Islamism. And Islamism is, I like the way Sam Harris puts it, there's these concentric circles that you can envision within Islam. And so you may have at the very center, if we place at the very center, jihadist, extremist. Then outside of that, you have Islamist, and then you have Islamism as another circle. And by the time you get out to that circle, you have what is necessarily seen by Western democracies as problematic ideology. Because even in that outer circle of Islamism, before you get into any kind of moderate and liberal Muslim circles, you have a significant minority who embrace ideals that are in stark contrast to liberal democracies. And I don't mean that liberal in the sense of conservative liberal politics. I mean liberal in the sense of the ideas of self-governance by the people and ideas of egalitarianism and equal rights and so on. But so Islamism is a relatively potent and somewhat recent political force. In many ways, that political force and that response is a response to Western colonialism and Zionism. Islamism began early in Islamic history, but it moved into our field of view after the 9/11 attacks. And then from there, as we all know, debate over the compatibility of Islam with Western civilization has raged ever since. So we can't look at these things without taking a serious look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is, even as I'm sitting here recording this, we've been dealing with the most recent Hezbollah terrorist attacks against Israel and Israel's, some would argue, state-run terrorism against the Gaza Strip. So I won't give my own views on any of that, but I'll let you try to guess. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what is all that about? Well, first of all, it's often depicted as this ages-old religious conflict between the ideologies of Judaism and Islam. But that is not true. Let's just get that out of the way. It's not true. The religious differences aggravate the problem, but they don't cause them. By the end of the 19th century, this is really where it starts. By the end of the 19th century, you had this rise in nationalism, kind of like we're seeing today with the Christian nationalism in our own country and other forms of nationalism, where people were identifying very strongly with their own national tribe. And so this increase in nationalism at the end of the 19th century was becoming really extreme in Europe. And some of this was touted by a man named Theodor Herzl and his proposal for a state in Palestine for the Jews. This is the father. So Theodor Herzl becomes the father of Zionism in most scholarly opinion. Now, the truth is that most Zionists early on were dreaming about, first of all, they were secular. Most of them were not religious Jews. And yes, they were dreaming about a state for Jews, but not necessarily a Jewish state. That's important to remember. This is the mindset of most Jews, looking back on the history, most Zionist Jews, were, yes, we should have a state that is friendly toward us, a place to go and be a people within a state that is friendly for us, but not necessarily we should have our own state, period, where we are in control. Now, in 1917, the British Empire issued what's known as the Balfour Declaration. And this promised the establishment the establishment specifically in Palestine of a home for the Jewish people. Now, at that time, in 1917, the Ottoman Empire was actually in control of the Palestinian area, all of modern-day Turkey, most of the western Arabian Peninsula, and much of, if not all of Iraq. I don't remember specifically. But so that whole region was what was left of the Ottoman Empire by 1917. But then we have World War I, and the Ottoman Empire falls apart. So I want to point this out, though, about the Ottoman Empire, because there's a stark contrast between what the socio-political atmosphere was like in the region of Palestine then versus what it's become. So under Ottoman rule, Jewish, Muslim, Christian populations were all roughly equal. They were all seen as having equal rights. And while that's not completely true, it's mostly true. And what is definitely true is that they coexisted peacefully. You didn't have this vitriol between them like you see in modern day Israel/Palestine. There's a popular example that I saw one religious scholar give of a guy named Wasif, who was a celebrity in the 1900s. He was a musician, performer that happened to be an Orthodox Christian, a devout Orthodox Christian, but cited himself. In an interview, he said, "Look, when I was in school, I celebrated Jewish, Christian, and Islamic holidays with my friends and with my fans. Even today, when he did the interview, I celebrate those things. But this was all about to change radically. In fact, I think he died in 1972. So." And born in the 1800s. So he imagined the change that he saw during his lifetime in his world. Dramatic. So back to the conflict between Israel and Palestine and the development of this. So you have the Ottoman Empire falls apart after World War I. The British promised the rule of Palestine to three groups, basically. The Meccans, meaning those who affiliated with Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula, and the Zionist, Theodore Herzl's group, and themselves. So Palestine becomes officially a British colony. And even though it was a British colony, the way that the Brits went about things were a lot like the Romans. They allowed for a lot of self-governance. And so they promoted the Balfour Declaration and facilitated, as part of their colonization there, efforts, they supported a large immigration of Jewish immigrants to the Palestinian area. And they increased the population. The Jewish population increased under that time by 320,000. Which is a big number given the small region. Now, as a result of this, increasingly Palestinian farmers were being evicted by new Zionist Jewish landowners. And by 1938, they had had enough, and they revolted against the British. And the British respond with the help of Jewish militia, and they violently ended the revolt. But as happens with these things, when you violently put down a movement, it usually sparks massive nationalist hopes and dreams. And so Palestinian nationalism really started to become a thing after this. Prior to this, it was hard to say who were Palestinians, so to speak. But now they were galvanized as a national group. And by the end of World War II, the British starts to let go of its colonies, including Palestine. And Palestine ends up being one of the colonies handed over to the United Nations. So the United Nations recognize that and as you can imagine, and probably most would argue rightly so, there's tremendous sympathy among the nations for the Jewish people. They are a people without a home. They were a people grossly persecuted, obviously, by the Nazis. So there's a lot of sympathy in the UN. And so they propose a plan to establish a homeland in the Palestinian region for the Jews, their own. So this is separate from the Balfour Declaration by the Brits. So, what did it look like when they came forward with this proposal? Well, in 1946, 94% of the Israeli, what we know today as Israel and Palestine, was owned by Palestinian landowners. 94%. 1947, the UN plan comes out and reduces that land ownership to 43%. Now think about it from, you got to try to put yourself in the sandals of these folks, right? You're looking at land that you own and has probably been in your family for generations, and the UN comes in and says, yeah, but the Jews have had it hard, and which is true. And we're going to give your land, your family's land. I know it's hard, but we're going to give it to these immigrants. Okay. So suddenly, land ownership among Palestinians is reduced to 43% from 94%. Then, in 1948, you can imagine why, if you're looking from the Palestinian point of view, we have the Israeli-Arab War. Israel wins that war handily, and ends up occupying 33% more land than the UN had proposed in 1947. So then we get out to 1949, and the effects of this war results in 700,000 Palestinians, refugees fleeing the area into surrounding Arab countries. And as you can imagine, the Zionists mark this as the year of the birth of the Jewish nation. How do Palestinians mark it? They mark it as the Nakba, which means catastrophe, because it's the year that they became stateless. So, moving forward in time, we get to the 1967 Six-Day War. Again, Israel handily defeats the coalition between Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, decimates their air force, and captures all previously Palestinian territories, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. They just ran roughshod on these folks. Now, again, if I'm looking from the Israeli side, I'm going, why can't we have a place to call home? And you attacked us, so we kicked your ass. Too bad, so sad. In Egypt, you were a part of this, so we're taking the peninsula. In Syria, you were a part of this, and we're taking this strategically important area called the Golan Heights. And all the Palestinians that were involved in Jordan, well, all those territories are ours now. So, if we look at the map today, we went from 94% land ownership in the hands of Palestinian landowners in 1946. 1947, the UN plan calls for reducing that to 43%, with the rest in the hands of Jewish immigrants. 1949 to 1967, it's reduced to 22%. So what's happened since then, since 1967? Effectively, about 12% of the land is owned by Palestinians and controlled by Palestinians. 12%. And we wonder why there's a conflict. I've been there. I've seen the difference when you cross from Israeli territory into Palestinian territory, controlled territory. I've seen the effects of economic devastation wrought by border control. I've heard arguments from both sides. And I think, just my personal opinion, the leadership on both sides of this conflict are very ineffective, if not just downright bad. That's my personal opinion. So we have this ongoing clash, of cultures, this debate going on, and it's come back into the spotlight with the Hezbollah attacks on Israel and Israel's attack on the Gaza, and this is an ideological clash. Again, you have Western nation states, Western countries, and their ideals of secular democracy. Secular doesn't mean atheistic, okay? It just means we're not going to be theocratic. We're not going to be ruled by a religion, okay? These Western democracies are largely egalitarian, equal rights for everyone. At least that's the ideal. Doesn't play out that way, but that's the ideal. Pluralism. We all can be different and get along. And then, generally speaking, a liberal to moderate approach to differences. And then you have theocratic states like proposed by, yes, a minority, but a significant minority of folks in Islamic states who favor theocratic rule. Not rule by the people, but rule by God, in essence, which of course means rule by the religious hierarchy. And they are exclusivistic, not pluralistic. There's no question about that. There are massive human rights violations, judging by Western standards, against women and religious minorities especially. And they do not lean liberal moderate, they lean extremist. Not even conservative. You can't really say that about the minority, the significant minority. They are extremist in their views. So what do I mean by that? Well, going back to Sam Harris's concentric circles. Yes, there is a tiny minority of Islamic jihadist, extremist. Then you have Islamist, and then you have Islamism. If you take all three of those population groups, though, that's what becomes the significant minority. And the problem there is even among the less extremist Muslim populations, you still have a significant majority in some of these countries who believe things like execution for those who are apostate, that is, those who leave the Islamic faith, is the proper response, execution. Or the majority population believing that stoning of a woman caught in adultery is the proper response to that adultery. So what am I getting at? Well, in this debate, we have liberals and conservatives saying two extremely different things, right? You have liberals who, well, let's start with conservatives. We have conservatives basically saying we should all be afraid because Islam is extremist. That's not really true. Islam is not an extremist religion in and of itself. And its holy texts does not support that view. Of course, you can interpret certain passages, but there are actually fewer passages that support extremism than can be found in the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible. That's the truth. And then you have liberals on the other side who scream in Islamophobia at anyone who cites actual data like 86% in a Pew Research poll, I think in 2010 or 12, that where 86% of them said this death penalty, execution, is the proper response for those who leave the Islamic faith. 86%. Now, they may not be extremists in other ways. They may not, a majority may not promote suicide bombing. But they do promote things like that. And that is definitely a problem for those of us who embrace Western ideals. And so the problem for me anyway is when the media that we digest comes primarily from either pole, okay? The polar extremes on the right or the left typically do not reflect the reality that we're living in. And so what I'd like to see more people do is actually educate themselves with sources that are trustworthy, neutral politically, neutral ideologically. In fact, if the ideology of the source is secular neutrality, then it's probably the most trustworthy source. Okay, just that's wrong to overgeneralize, but if their ideology is neutrality, that's going to be better than looking at super far left or super far right sources. I shouldn't have to even say that. But I do. Look at the environment that we're in. I mean, never mind the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but just look at where we're at. And the problem is the average person is going to suffer, like has been true throughout human history, for the extremist on either side being the loudest. There's my thoughts. I appreciate you tuning in for this. I know it was a little bit different than what I've talked about in this religion course so far. I think it's stuff that's important for us to talk about. And the majority of the people that I have in class and the majority of people that would perchance watch this need to be better educated about what it means to be a Christ follower looking at these issues. And certainly a big part of that is to live by the truth, not by confirmation bias, personal opinion, political ideology, but by the truth. Thanks for watching.